I've really enjoyed all the discussion we've had and the fact that we all come from different perspectives. Some of you may share my story. In my experience, 5 simple words are really all anyone should need to get started grappling with data modeling issues unwittingly. Oh, my spacebar's not working. I'm sorry. Let me try this again. Slideshow. It is not working. Let me see if I can do this. Okay. How hard can it be? That's what has gotten me started many times. And it's a very productive question if you ask it in the right rhetorical spirit. I'm in presentation, am I? Slideshow's not working for me. I've tried that and it's not doing it. I think I have a bug in my LibreOffice. So I won't, yeah, if you'll bear with me, I'll just show it this way and not waste your time with technical issues, which always have ways of inserting themselves, which is part of the story. So counties you would think would be very easy. This is a visualization that comes with a D3 JavaScript library for visualization. This is an example. They give you lots of examples. So it's evidence that this is easy. We know what counties are in the United States. They have boundaries that are fixed. There's a lot of data that's collected around them, census data. This is unemployment density in 2009. We could take 2008, 2007, and compare, visualize. I've spent a lot of time working among historians, and I'd like to push back in time a little bit. So we could go to the published census volumes, or we could look at the historical census browser that the University of Virginia has had up for many years, and pick a year, and then look at the state census values or county census values, maybe Portage County, Wisconsin, and choose some population figures from 1840 and 1850. And in 1840, you notice there were 1,600 people in Portage County. In 1850, about 1,200. So this is Portage County seems to have lost some population. Actually, Wisconsin became a state in 1848, so you'd think it would be growing. Something's happening. And it's a very white state. There's very white county. There's a highly skewed male-female ratio that becomes somewhat less skewed. So this is a common thing that historians do with data. You pick 2 years, it's the same county, and okay, let me try another method and go to the backup PDF. How's this? Okay, thank you. Okay, so we see the population, something's happening. We've got 2 points, we've got 1 county, and we can start building a story or speculating about a narrative behind this. One of the interesting things about Portage County, though, is that it's a different county in some sense. The coordinate stream has a date-modified value, let's say, in Allen's terms. So is it really the same county or isn't it? And what we're seeing here in 1840, that's not a sloppy arrow. Portage County in 1840 really did consist of 2 non-contiguous areas. They had been contiguous. Another county got stamped out to the west of it and separated them. And by 1850, it moved. And it didn't really just kind of slide up there. If I showed you what happened in the 1840s for much of the time, there was Portage County was much bigger, encompassed both of these areas, and went all the way to the northern border of Wisconsin. So boundaries do make a difference, and in some ways, identity makes a difference. This is a problem only because we commit to Portage County. That slide was borrowed from John Long, who's the editor of the Atlas of Historical County Boundaries. This was a project of the Newberry Library that completed in 2010. It took 20 years. It documents every change in counties in the United States from the 1630s to the year 2000, state by state. I worked at the Newberry for 15 years until recently, and was just down the hall from John and his colleagues for many years. There's the Newberry. The project actually goes back more than 20 years. It has its roots in the 1970s. Lester Cappan was a historian and archivist, early American historian, who went to the Newberry, started the Atlas of Early American History, and John was assistant editor of that. Barbara Pachenik was cartographic editor. They were concerned to tell historical stories and also do the research very well, and also do the cartography well. And in the course of that work, they discovered that they thought there would be resources on where counties were, and there just wasn't. So they started a new project. In the late 1970s, John started a project that was interestingly both digital and print-based, working with the cartography lab at the University of Wisconsin to start documenting where counties were based on primary research. They produced 5 volumes covering 14 states. They produced data files, which are on deposit with ICPSR, so you can download them today, but John says don't. There's better data available now. So that project ran into difficulties, methodological and technological difficulties, which I'll talk about in a minute. I'm giving you a brief project overview, and then we'll get to the data modeling specifics. In the late 1980s, John started a new project, having learned from the earlier problems, and that was the 20-year project that initially produced books. In the 1990s, they produced 19 volumes, 24 states and the District of Columbia. A lot happened during the 1990s. By the year 2000, the publisher was no longer interested in publishing this kind of book. But as we all know, computing got much better on the desktop in the 1990s. GIS software was available. So they increasingly moved to digital methods. And after the year 2000, they became their own digital publisher. I was involved with a piece of the project that retrospectively digitized the books, but the core team, especially at the end, was John Long, Peggy Cinco, Emily Kelly, and Pete Sizowitz, and a number of others who've helped, but they were really incredibly dedicated. So I'm really talking about their work. Why did it take so long? Counties are creatures of the states, or colonies in the early years, or territorial governments. So the research that went into this was really text-based. They didn't start with maps. They certainly consulted base maps, but they had to start with the laws and the laws of each state. So they would go to the law library and come back with Xeroxes. And this is what a typical primary source looks like. Be it enacted by the General Assembly of the State of Missouri that all that portion of territory bounded as follows, and then there's a description of various points on the landscape, and then they say that all of that territory, you go back to the beginning point, that shall compose one county, and then they assign a name to that county, and it exists. So this, I think, is performative speech, as people have been saying. This is intentionality of a kind. And I think this is an example of modeling being something that we inherit. The counties would not exist if the state legislatures didn't invent them. So this is, in a way, it's not quite right to say that the model is not the thing. Here, there is no thing until you model it, or until they modeled it. And it's based on earlier models, actually. I guess the other thing I would say is that some of these points are points in the landscape, but there are also things like the line between townships 43 and 44. There's a whole Northwest Ordinance. If you've flown over the middle part of the United States, there's a grid that's evident in the land, which is the result of earlier acts of modeling that surveyed that land and imposed a grid on it, and that's part of the reference system that they're building this on. When the 1970s and early 80s project saw this, they decided to model this as a set of line segments, and they said, we'll figure out what the atomic segments are, and then we will be able to say what those coordinates are that define that, and then from such and such a date to another date, on the left-hand side it's this county, and on the right-hand side it's some other county. And that made a lot of sense back then because coordinates were expensive. It was really hard to manage this kind of thing. As I mentioned, this was a project at the Newberry in Chicago in collaboration with the cartography lab at the University of Wisconsin. So the method was the Newberry would come up with the coordinates. There would be a couple of editors doing quality control, sitting down with pages of numbers like this and reading digit by digit to each other to make sure that they were looking at the same thing. They would ship that off to Wisconsin. which would enter it into a computer, run it through a plotter, and send the plot back to Chicago. So the feedback loop was very slow for this. So I have a lot of sympathy for why this was difficult, and why this approach didn't quite work. When the project started up again in the late 1980s, they dropped digital methods altogether, and they focused on getting the methodology right for just knowing what they were describing. So it would be a piece of tracing paper. This was a step that they called historical compilation. So you can see that the Xeroxes of the laws are there. The historical compiler would read the laws, would trace out what they thought the laws were describing based on their research, and try to cram as many of those counties as possible onto one piece of tracing paper to be sure that they were getting the right coverage, getting the whole story, and that it all made sense. So this actually means modeling it so that you can ask several questions at once, and modeling it in looking at it in several different ways, and that's really key to why this method works. They were doing this for print publication so that they could produce pages like this that would tell the story of a single county through time, with the idea that you would look at McHenry County in Illinois, let's say, and you'd want the chronology of legislative events. You see that at the top. That includes all legislative events, not just the ones that are mappable. So there are things that happen that aren't mappable. Sometimes they rename something, or they just redefine what the boundaries are without really making a difference in how it's mapped, especially at this scale. And they also give you the maps, and they're drawing these by hand, so they don't really care about redundant line segments. They're cheap. So this is one output from historical compilation. The other is making sure that we have a comprehensive story of the area. And sometimes there are contradictions. So there were areas of overlap. And if it was an area of overlap that came from the compiler misunderstanding what they were reading, they could catch that and correct it. But sometimes the legislature made a mistake. They got it wrong. And sometimes it took them years to catch up with their own error, but they eventually acknowledged it and corrected it. And sometimes there were disputes where different states would contest the same area, and it would need to be resolved through negotiation or through legislative acts. And this is the kind of contradiction that needs to be modeled. So we can't simply correct the original mistake and just pretend that it didn't happen. We need a meta model around the original model that says, it's inconsistent, but it's an inconsistency that has to be recorded, that is a permanent part of the record. You'll also see up there to the northeast of the yellow area, NCA 3, NCA 4, those are non-county areas. So in the course of historical compilation, the compilers noticed that there were areas that the legislatures didn't name and didn't really care about a lot, except when they could carve new counties out of it once the population reached a certain density. But in order to make the stories make sense, they had to invent and really model new things that you could tell stories about. So you can look up in these books non-county area 3 and get an invented story that is useful because it really gives us something that has appropriate temporal and spatial coverage for the whole state. Behind the scenes, the data looks like this. You can download all this data. It's as shapefiles, as text files. There are chronologies and indexes. There's a lot of textual data that went into this project. It's not just geospatial. I guess I would draw your attention to the identifier, the ID field. That was a project-invented identifier. They found that there really was nothing that could be used. The first column there is the FIPS code, at Federal Information Processing Standard. So those are used in federal data sets to refer to counties. The first two digits are the state, and then 3 digits for the county. But if you look at them historically, we don't have much of a historical sense in the United States. The federal government would issue the data set and make the numbers match alphabetical order. And if alphabetical order changed, they would just assign new numbers. So they don't really serve as identifiers over time, which shocks me, but that's the way it is. The version number is blank in some cases because we assign versions only to the ones that are mappable. So, but the full record, the model here is legislative events, even more than it is county boundaries in some ways. I guess the other thing I would draw attention to in the creation or change field is how redundant this is. There's a row here for every county to record its perspective. So you'll see that Campbell gained from Anderson and Overton Anderson lost to Campbell, Overton lost to Campbell. This made sense for book production. This worked for a process where you had a spreadsheet or a database. I think it would be interesting today, if the project were starting today, to think of how you would model that as a relationship and then generate these descriptions from it. But I can say there's a lot of exceptions and a lot of kind of idiosyncratic stories that are in that creation or change field that would be very difficult to model and impractical to do in that way. So there is something that would be lost by doing it that way. And every one of these changes has a citation. There are something like 17,000 different shapes. Ultimately, there are about 3,000 counties in the US today, more than that, but that's why it took 20 years. There's a lot there. Part of the process here, to kind of back up, there are many complexities to this. Part of the process is building up an understanding of what a county is, and then doing the research, and then finding something that frustrates that understanding, and then adapting the model. This is an example. This is from the South Carolina chronology, and is one memorable instance of that kind of thing. South Carolina has counties, but historically they also had parishes and districts, and they had sometimes the same name but different geographies. They coexisted at different times. So when you get to South Carolina, you have to add a new column to your database, add a new layer to your interface, and rethink the model. So to get to the question of my title, I think the pattern here is that there's a thing that changes. We want to tell a story about counties. When we want to tell a story of change over time, which is what anyone doing historical kind of research does, you want to have some way of referring to that thing, and have some property of it that captures that change, like the population of Portage County changed. But we need to know that we're talking about the same Portage County. So there's part of this is building ways of representing time into our models. We can add a column for start date and end date. But I think there's also an issue of how we historicize the model and allow for the fact that the thing we want to talk about, what a county is, itself has a history, and that's going to need something else to encompass that. I had some fun drawing up a list of things that could change over time, of various kinds related to this matter, and I think I kind of set this up with some gotchas, with some surprises. So I had a canned thing where I showed you the population first and then said, but you didn't know that the boundaries changed, but they did. So now I think now we know that boundaries change. Counties should be easy now, right? We've got the data, so I feel comfortable. But if you look at population characteristics, those too change over time. And so I'm imagining taking something like the historical census browser and expressing it in RDF as a set of assertions, and thinking that all we need are identifiers. Well, we could easily have URIs for these things, and the technology for doing that might be easier than the conceptual work of well, do we want to do that? How do we know that these, which of these are the same and which are different in different years? And this is what exercises historians I know. And if we don't model this right, I think there will be difficulties. So I think I'll leave it with that. That's.
Slide about things that might change over time. What about the slide that might say things that are stable over time?
Actually, all of them could be stable over time, right? Misinterpretations might be stable over a line, or we might have a model of misinterpretation, right? That says, well, I've seen that kind of thing before, and now that I know how to accommodate it.
So the things on that side could also just as easily appear on the other side about what's the things
Sure.
that fix it. Yeah.
Sure.
Okay.
But what about the set of things that you know will change over time? Are there any in that list, or is it an empty slot?
I won't make any commitments to that myself, but I think, I think you never know. That's,
There is a research going on with King's. Is a PhD student of ours, most of them know him, or even I think, is doing a research on some Sami material. In the 18th century, the Norwegian, Swedish, and Finland area was not divided on paper. So there was, a certain point you were in Norway, a certain point you were in Sweden, but you didn't know where, in particular where the Sami lived, because they are nomadic people. So at a certain point they decided that they had needed to have a boundary somewhere. And the way they decided to do that was to interview the people and say, where do you feel you belong? Where do you think you are? Because that was the only way they could find out. Do you think you live in Norway? Do you think you live in Sweden? And as they asked them to define the area in which that they think they belong, so to describe the territory. His attempt is to take this description that are oral and then transcribe in another language, so there is a lot of filters, and trying to plot them in a map, which is a fascinating approach. And he stopped to a point, though, because he couldn't go on, because some information are missing. Because at a certain point they described 3 borders out of 4, and one is not described because it's given. Or he say, you go on until that ends, until the wood ends. This was the description, and the woods now is not there anymore. So now you know exactly. So do you find that the question is, he said that I'm modeling the impossibility, where you don't have the information, you cannot model. Do you
Yes.
have a problem like that?
yes, and my colleagues who did the actual historical compilation would be much better at answering this with concrete detail, but I know in the books, they had dotted lines sometimes, and they could say, this is approximate. With the GIS files, it's much harder to do that. Yeah, definitely.
There is the uncertainty, the impossibility of declaring many times.
Right.
We don't know.
Well, another issue too is in the books they could draw a line with a pen and know that it's 1 to 1 to 500,000, and so the pen width is on the landscape is pretty wide. But with GIS, you add another decimal point, and it's absurdly precise without really having any meaning. Yeah.
I think this talk is essential from the point of view of data modeling, identifying what you've been doing as a resource for many other researchers in the humanities. And because of that, you need to identify within your data modeling activities what are the entry points if you were to put this resource online, like each stable state of a county, so that, for instance, someone annotating a corpus of letters at a given period referring to a specific county could actually point to this object while annotating his resource. And this is also related to what you said, Lenas. And I think part of our data modeling thinking should be about those stable entities we want to bring to the community from various fields so that we can actually network them for whatever reason.
That's right, yeah. And that is for this project, that is the intentions of it from the beginning, is to be a reference resource for further study.
Right. So, as I said the other day, I think that the modeling change is a tremendous challenge in data modeling. And it plays out differently in these 2 categories, I guess we've kind of emerged here, pragmatic modeling and theoretic modeling. In pragmatic modeling, you have to move on. You have other things to do, and you must come up with a solution to the problem of change in a reasonable amount of time with a reasonable amount of effort and money so that you can move forward. In theoretic data modeling, you can't move on. There's a sense, it's a little extreme to put it this way, but a sense in which you can't move on. The whole point is to solve this problem. So there's no moving on until you solve it. Now, there it is. But and it's really hard. That list that you put up of things that change strike me as each one of them things that do not change. I just noticed a few that may. But there's a sense. But at first I looked at those and I said, yeah, here's the problem. None of these change. None of them. So notice we're completely opposite from the discussion taking place over here. We say that they change, but as soon as we use the unforgiving, logic-based data description languages that have become popular, like RDF, etc., we start boxing ourselves in and find ourselves unable to represent change. And part of the problem is these are cultural objects. So I think the problem of change is, I think, primarily one that faces us because we're dealing with cultural objects. And it's cultural objects that have a particular kind of, they have a nature that makes them difficult to understand as changing in the sense implied by your title, with your title suggesting that if there is change, there is an underlying subject that changes. There is a thing that changes. This is Aristotelian view. Elaborate what is this?
I really enjoyed your talk the other day and thought a lot about this, and I'm still a bit puzzled by this question of, I think in here with state legislatures, we have intentionality in a naive way, at least as I would say it. The legislature intends that the county be the same and assigns it different boundaries and says, it is the same thing and it's different, and the fact that its geographic attributes are different doesn't matter to us, which might lead to modeling problems. But I think if we want to model what they intended, that makes my mind boggle.
I wanted, you had your hand up for a long time, but I just want to add one question to this one, which is, if in acknowledging the kind of human intuitive sense in which the county is the thing we're interested in, that there is a thing there that is changing, is it possible to handle these changes by granularity? In other words, by qualifying the county with time, with whatever, and saying, in effect, there is this one, and there is also this one, and then describing the relationship between them that acknowledges that the relationship is of intuitive identity.
Exactly.
Right? I mean, is that sloppy? Or?
I think that's the intent of the whole project, and that's what they do. As pragmatic modelers, that's what they did. And I guess the other thing I would say in response to the pragmatic versus theoretic is, as pragmatic modelers, they didn't call themselves data modelers, they called themselves editors, but I think it's a good word to have in mind for the pragmatic end of it.
I have 1.5 questions. One you already asked. I think this kind of granularity question, right? You could look at cities, which the census also covers, right? And there you have the same problem because New York City changes tremendously from one year to the other because Brooklyn is just counted as New York City. Right? We have the same problems on a different granularity level again. But then on that granularity level, we could then go back to the country, to the counties, because the distribution of the towns within the counties might be so striking, right? So this county, which changes shape completely, may have 95% of the population in the one place where it overlaps, for example. And so there may be solutions in the data. And the other thing I think is there is not only a problem of change, and there's also a problem of morality in the data modeling all of a sudden, because if you look at the ethnicities, right, who has collected this data? That's obviously racist. And that's something which we have in much more data right now. If you look at like the Afghan war diaries of WikiLeaks or genocide data in Vietnam, there's people working about this, and I think this is a really, really strong data modeling problem, because in the end, that goes all the way to crime, right? If you say reason of release is shot in the Auschwitz prisoner records, which is a data model because it's a card where they enter the stuff, right? There's something we can actually do something really dangerous.
The more the modeling is enacted by the authority of the state, the easier it is to model, and the more we need that provenance to wrap it so that we say it comes from somewhere. Absolutely.
Well, I corroborate all of this. I mean, it's all about Frankenstein again, right? The thing is that what's so interesting about this list to me is not just that you have things that can change, you also have things that are acting on one another, right? I mean, a judicial decision changes something else, right? I mean, and this goes to your point about intentionality and performance, is that these things are defined by virtue of other entities that we're also trying to understand and map. And those relationships are such that their very definition, what it is that constitutes a county as a county is implicated in the definition of something else by way of that something else's definition of itself. And you know, this connects to what Max is saying, because this network of mutual implication includes the historian. And the problem is that, you know, and of course historians and historiographers are very much concerned with this, is that, you know, history can be seen as an objective study of the past, or it can be seen as an ideological project to justify something that we want to believe.
Thank you. Yeah,
Right?
yeah, that's right.
And so where is it that you found the boundaries in all this?
That's I really appreciate that question, because that's another way I thought of ending up is you know, the answer to the question, what is the thing that changes, should be followed by what is the thing that changes as a result of our active modeling, as a rhetorical, as a, you know, social intervention in the world. I think that's your question. It's a great question.
This is a great presentation, and it's also terrifying. And it's a terrifying one because it might, I mean, I think we have a tendency to look at it and say that this is that this is sort of a particular domain in which these kinds of problems surface, when in fact it may be the case that this is actually, this is the problem no matter what you do.
Yeah.
And you only, it brings it forward more powerfully. And, you know, it's exactly for the reason that Alan said, is that we don't really have a robust account of state identity in our data models, period. And I'm inclined to, and I don't know, it might be, I don't know if this is what Alan said, but this is what I'll say, is that one of our problems may be that we look at this and we say that list is a set of mutable values over time, when in fact what it may be is a set of immutable values, and that the identity of the object is some slice of that, the collective set of immutable properties.
Right.
You know, that's a very different way of thinking about objects and labeling them.
Yeah.
Right. But it may be one that actually has implications not only for this kind of problem, but for the rest of data modeling. And it may be that everything is sort of immersed in this Heraclitean fire, and we need to make that, bring that forward, or else we're, you know, which, and again, I accept the distinction between pragmatic data, practical data modeling, and so forth.
In response to that, I was really interested and troubled by your distinction yesterday between noun people and verb people, and I thought at first I must be a verb person because I want to talk about change, but then I thought, wait a minute, change is a noun. For, you know, change over time, that's noun, preposition, noun. And I think that's what the historical method is actually to look at the thing that changes and then figure out how do we stabilize it through narrative, right? Which is what, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is just an amazing project, and also thank you so much for making all that data available so that the rest of us can go and play with it and bring it into our projects. And
That's to the, I should say that's to the credit of the Newberry Library, and the project was funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Thank you to all involved. But just one other thing, just to pick up on a couple other threads, and one of the interesting things about this particular data set is that it's also referencing a period of an expanding land empire. As the United States, as what becomes, you know, the British colonial into the United States, moving across time. And so, since you're only dealing with states, it's not as big an issue if you're handling territories. But even so, when something becomes a state, there's an issue about who the population that may or may not be considered citizen for any number of reasons,
right,
and deciding, you know, who might live within those lines and who may not consider themselves part of the United States at all.
Right.
And then as another thing to sort of worry about when you look at shapefiles for imperial systems, that you've got some, there are plenty of people living east of a particular line who might hotly contest that they are in fact part of the system that has drawn a line around them.
If you download the whole set, you will find some boundaries for Spanish territory, but American Indian history is not not formally represented here, and in some ways it's all over it. And what would be the ethics of formalizing it? That's also an interesting question.
Probably this is very obvious in the philosophy of personal identity. They made this proposal to say probably you can't describe identity by defining specific features, but and one of the new proposals to say, okay, then probably it's the narrative about change, and so that all these things can change, but they belong together because there's a narrative keeping them together and saying this was the thing which, and so maybe constructing the whole object like this is probably the best way.
Yeah, I don't know what that would look like, but what if narrative were the primitive?
Well, you could break down the narrative to have, say, events which change a state, one of these states actually.
Let's take one more.
I think that's a very interesting point, right? So basically what to think about each point, each record you have as one of the opinions in the multiplicity of opinion. And then your timeline, so the change where you track is like if you put that all like a like a chain of pearls on one timeline. But actually what would be interesting to say, drop all these multiplicities of, all the multiplicity of opinion on one plane, right? And then say, what are the different narrative timelines going through this data? Because they may be very different, right? And the question is, do you preserve something like open shape files or something like that? Because obviously a lot of there wasn't one in the Henry example, in the analog example. There was one rectangle which was open in the analog version. That one, yeah, the upper one.
Oh,
So do you have something like that in the data? Where
you know, I think that's Chicago bias. That's the lake, and we
that's
just
right.
kind of take it for granted. I think that's what's going on.